The September winds swept through the towers of Oxford when Richard first saw the light of day in 1157. Son of the impetuous Henry II and the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine, the boy was born into greatness, but also into turmoil. From an early age, he learned that in the Game of Thrones, loyalty was as sharp as a sword's edge and as fickle as the breeze that stirred the Plantagenet banners. He was not the firstborn, he was not destined to rule, but fate, like an impatient craftsman, shaped its own will. He grew up in the court of Poitiers, among troubadours and knights, more enchanted by the ballads of bards than by palace intrigues. Yet his heart beat for the battlefield. With a sword in hand, Richard was more than a prince. He was a storm ready to descend upon his enemies. By the age of 16, he was already clad in armor, leading his men to quell rebellions in the turbulent Aquitaine. And how he fought! With the fury of thunder and the precision of a hunter, he crushed insurgents without hesitation. It was a cruel and rehearsed dance, and Richard, so young, had already mastered its steps. But the wheel of fortune turned without mercy. In 1183, death came to claim the heir to the throne, Henry, his elder brother. Overnight, Richard was no longer just a warrior, he was the future king. The weight of the crown loomed on his horizon, but one obstacle remained: his own father. Henry II was a hard man, forged in iron and ambition, and he would not relinquish his kingdom without a fight. Father and son clashed, not on battlefields, but in a relentless game of power. For years, Richard wavered between loyalty and rebellion, between love and ambition. But in 1189, the old king's death sealed the fate of his warrior son, and so Richard Plantagenet ascended the throne of England. But if they expected a monarch confined to castles and councils, they were mistaken. The lion had claimed a new kingdom, but his heart still longed for the battlefield. England had gained a king, but the world was about to meet a warrior. The bells of cathedrals echoed across Europe when the Crusade was proclaimed, and kings lifted their eyes to the east, where Jerusalem burned under Saladin's rule. For many, it was a divine calling. For Richard, it was destiny whispering in his ear. A king could rule his land, but a lion craved the battlefield. In 1190, Richard set sail with his fleet, crossing turbulent seas and foreign lands toward the heart of the Holy War. Beneath the scorching eastern sun, the Golden Lion's banners fluttered in the wind as the Crusaders marched under his command. And it was at Acre, before colossal walls and under a merciless siege, that Richard showed the world why he was not merely a king, but a living legend. For months, the siege consumed men, resources, and hope. Arrows fell like rain, catapults roared like thunder, and the earth was stained crimson. But when Richard landed, feverish and weak, his eyes burned with the fury of a man who did not accept defeat. He reorganized the attacks, led his men, and like an unrelenting predator, tore through the Muslim defenses. In July 1191, Acre fell. It was the first of many victories. But war spared no one, not even the triumphant. The heat was relentless, the battles unceasing, and Saladin, the great sultan, was no ordinary enemy. As Richard marched toward Jerusalem, Saladin shadowed him like a phantom, harassing his men, testing his endurance. At Jaffa, the city fell to the Muslim forces. But before Saladin's victory could be sealed, the winds of war shifted and brought Richard back. Landing with only a small army, the warrior king faced an overwhelming force and, against all odds, seized the city for himself. His name became a whisper among the Saracens: Malik Rik, the Demon King, the Untamed Lion. Yet even with all his strength and cunning, Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp. And so, after years of blood and sacrifice, Richard saw that he would not win by the sword alone. In a decision as bold as any battle, he struck an agreement with Saladin. The walls of Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to enter the holy city without fear. It was not a victory, but it was no defeat either. The crusade had ended, but Richard was not a man to return home in peace. Europe awaited him. Enemies lurked in the shadows, and the king who had set out as a hungry lion had yet to find his rest. The lion had won battles in the east, challenged Saladin, and left his mark on the sacred soil. But war did not end with swords sheathed. On his way home, Richard encountered an enemy that could not be struck down on the battlefield: betrayal. It was the winter of 1192 when, disguised as a simple traveler, Richard crossed the Germanic lands, trying to evade the watchful eyes of his enemies. But a king, even wrapped in rags, never ceases to be a king. In Vienna, he was recognized and captured by Duke Leopold Fürst of Austria, the same man he had humiliated at Acre by ordering his banner thrown to the ground. The Duke had not forgotten, and he would not forgive. Imprisoned like a trophy, Richard was handed over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. The chains that bound his wrists were forged not only from iron, but from politics and vengeance. For 2 years, the warrior king languished in cold dungeons while his England writhed in internal strife, and his longtime rival, Philip II of France, schemed to seize his lands. But kings are not easily forgotten, and legends even less so. Richard's ransom became a matter of honor and of fortune. The price of his freedom was set at an exorbitant sum, enough gold to build fortresses or sustain entire armies. England bled its wealth, subjects paid heavy tributes, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, his tireless mother, moved heaven and earth to secure his release. In February 1194, the prison doors swung open. The lion was free. But the war was far from over. Richard returned to England not as a defeated king, but as a warrior who had survived the impossible. Betrayal, intrigue, power struggles, none of it mattered the moment he set foot on his land. His first act was not to rest, but to act. He crushed internal threats, reaffirmed his rule, and without hesitation, turned his gaze to France. Philip had tried to steal his legacy. Now, Richard would march to take it back. Captivity might have tamed an ordinary man, but for Richard the Lionheart, it had been nothing more than a brief winter before another storm. The thunder of war never ceased for Richard the Lionheart. The Crusade was behind him, captivity a mere dark memory, but the real battle had always been closer than he realized, and his most dangerous enemy wore a crown. Philip II of France was not a man of steel, but of cunning. Where Richard conquered by the edge of his sword, Philip conquered with words, alliances, and well-orchestrated betrayals. For years, the French king maneuvered to weaken Richard's control over his continental holdings. But the lion was not a creature easily cornered. From castle to castle, field to field, Richard marched, reclaiming territories, crushing rebellions, and daring Philip to face him in direct combat. His presence was a call to arms, his sword an omen of destruction. War seemed like an eternal game between two kings, until fate, as cruel as always, intervened. In the spring of 1199, Richard was besieging the castle of Châlus-Chabrol, an insignificant fortress, almost a mere detail in his campaign. But the devil hides in the details. During an inspection of the walls, an arrow flew through the sky like a messenger of death and struck the king in the shoulder. It wasn't a fatal blow, not at first. The wound seemed like just another scar for his collection. But the steel of the arrow carried an invisible poison, infection. The following days were a slow and relentless decline. The fever burned like the sun of Jerusalem, but now there were no battles to win, no enemies to defeat. The lion was cornered. On his deathbed, he ordered that the archer who had struck him be brought before him. The young man trembled before the king, awaiting execution. But Richard, in an unexpected gesture, granted him mercy. The man who had lived by the sword chose compassion in his final moments. On the night of April 6, 1199, the heart that had fought so fiercely finally fell silent. His body was taken to the Abbey of Fontevraud to rest beside his parents. But kings like Richard do not die. Their legends live on, their stories echoing like the roar of a lion that never quiets.